Good evening, afternoon, night, morning, when in front of watch or listen to this podcast. It is me, Omar Sean Borja, the Burger Popper, and my friend Jackson. We're on with the Hardware Podcast heading into week 10. We're into double digits now into the season in terms of weeks. Jackson's feeling a little bit under the weather. And so we're going to do audio only for this week. But Jackson, how's everything going?
Yeah, doing good. Like you said, I can't believe we're in the double digit week mark. Unless you count week zero, then we hit it last week, but personally I don't. So no, we're really getting into the thick of it. It's November of football, man. It's where the going gets tough. So it's gonna be a lot of fun to watch. I every week I catch myself saying, this is the week we're gonna learn more about these teams. And it's like, dude, I'm probably gonna be saying that like going into like we the semifinals of like the playoff. Like it's just reality that's it's a never ending continuum of these teams or a never ending spectrum of these teams. And you learn more each and every week, and by the end of the season, we still won't know everything, right? And it'll be time to start all over and start for next year. So.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, especially now, this is a season that's looking like 2007 with the amount of parity that we were having this year, the amount of parity and unexpected upsets and new contenders. So with that being said, going to last week, I mean, we're just thinking about it. The past week really was not an eventful week for the Heisman race. I think there weren't too many upsets. There weren't too many signature moments for candidates, or at least for the candidates in the field. The most significant event really was Ashton Jeanty on Friday night and one of the most anticipated group of five games, I'll say of the playoff era, because there has been group of five games in the past before the playoff that were as anticipated as UNLV Boise State. I can think of 2010 Boise State Nevada off the top of my head, but one of the most anticipated group of five games of the playoff era. Ashton Jeanty had all the hype around him on Friday night. And that's not to say he performed bad. There's a lot of running backs in the country that would love to run for over 130 yards, but I said on a I said on a prior podcast that Hawaii made Ashton Jeanty look human, and now UNLV kind of has the formula for stopping Ashton Jeanty. So he only had 130 yards. He had I think less than 4 yards per carry as well. So Jackson, do you think that his stock hurt a bit in the Heisman race, despite Boise State getting a big win against UNLV?
Yeah, I think so. In the Heisman race, you always desire to look at, do these teams win because of the player that's being nominated, right? And you could argue that that wasn't the case necessarily, right? It wasn't, and he had a still a pretty normal workload, like 33 carries, only one touchdown off of that. But it's hard to say because it was a close game that they wouldn't win that game or that they would win that game without Ashton Jeanty, but it definitely wasn't the wow factor that we're used to seeing, right? It was a little bit less than what we're used to seeing, and it was still a lot, right? It was still a lot, but it was really like Maddox. If you had to put like an MVP, you would put Maddox Madsen, right? And so that's the tough thing, and especially as a group of five player and as a running back separately, much less put together, you need to be blowing out teams, and it needs to be all because of you. And that has been the case all year. And it just so happens that the matchup that we were kind of all anticipating the most of the entire year, because with Oregon, he wasn't really on the radar yet. I'm not going to count the what was it, September 7th, that they played Oregon. So I'm not going to count that one. But the most anticipated matchup of the year with Genty, it fell a little bit flat compared to what we were used to seeing.
Yeah, exactly. And all credit to Jeanty, though. He got hurt earlier on, and UNLV is running eight, nine-man boxes against him. But I think that's just formula from now on. I mean, it's kind of surprising that they stuck with it as long as they did because Maddox Madsen, like you said, had an amazing game, both through the air and on the ground. So I'm surprised that it worked for that long. UNLV stuck with it for that long. But the schedule looks a bit lighter, just heading to the rest of the year for Boise State. Assuming that they do play UNLV in the Mountain West title game, I mean, they don't really have anyone in the top echelon of the Mountain West. So they have Nevada next week. And I mean, so I think things get easier for Genty. I just don't know if he breaks the record, but if he has over 2,400 yards, I mean, I feel like it's hard to not give him the Heisman at this point with quarterback play. I wouldn't say at an all-time low, but just less than spectacular, really.
Yeah, the great teams are not as great as they used to be, and the bad teams are not as bad as they used to be. And you see examples of that across every conference and every level of play in college football. So, yeah, absolutely, it's definitely not at an all-time low by any means in quarterback play, but it's almost at an all-time equal because there's not the one or two players that look, make everyone else look silly, right? There's a lot of guys that you can have like a legitimate conversation about as far as being some of the best or one of the best quarterbacks in college football. So like for example, and I'll give an example of that then in that I was thinking of, myself in prepping for this. Dude, like we haven't mentioned Chandler Morris, the quarterback from North Texas, once this year. He's had a fantastic year, and his name hasn't even come up on the show, and we're in November. So he leads the nation in touchdowns, if you weren't aware. Haven't heard of him probably, and that's insane. That's something that you can't really say. It's all Shador, Cam Ward, Kate Klubnik. Those are really like Kyle McCord until he threw three pick sixes. Like those are really the names that we were all talking about, right? And there's guys that lead the nation in touchdown passes that like go unmentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just kind of a shame where North Texas is having a fine year this year in the American, but they're not a New Year's Six contender, or sorry, not New Year's Six, but not a playoff contender. And the one chance they had to play a Power Five team, excuse me, Chandler Morris was held at bay by Texas Tech, a very average Texas Tech defense, if you will. So,
As you found out last
yes, I did
fall.
find out. Yeah, as we were watching that game. Um, so I mean, it's interesting you say that because there's so much that goes in the formula of Heisman, especially if you're a quarterback. But I mean, there really wasn't much else to say for quarterback wise. Cam Ward didn't have a bad game, didn't have too exciting game. I feel like it kind of hurt him a little bit that Florida State Miami wasn't a nationally important game because of Florida State's struggles, because that's always a game that people still get up for. So I feel like you heard there. Dylan Gabriel had a great game in a blowout against Illinois, not really down to the wire. So he remains a front runner too. That's not taking away from him. But talking about former Pac-12 schools, we have Travis Hunter, who became the first player in Big 12 history to win Defensive Player of the Week and Offensive Player of the Week. And kudos to Colorado. I did not think that they would be a bowl team after the Nebraska game, but they are very much a Big 12 front runner. And they have some key games coming up. They may need they may need Kansas State, excuse me, to drop a game or two. And they'll also need help from BYU. They'll need help from BYU losing it as well as Iowa State. But Colorado is legit. I will say that. I'll admit that I was wrong after the Nebraska game. But Travis Hunter, do you think Travis Hunter being in such a stacked Big 12 with Colorado being on the back end of the rankings, do you think that hurts him in the Heisman race?
I don't think it hurts him. I think that what he is accomplishing kind of transcends conference talent depth. I don't think that with him playing, what is it, 95% of snaps in games, if he doesn't win the Heisman, it's not going to be because there's so many other people in this conference that we're talking about. And I think that's uh previously been an issue for a lot of guys. I think it's not an issue for Travis, particularly because of his situation. But I don't think it's going to take us a few years to get used to. I don't really think that's going to be the norm from now on, considering we have, we call it the Power Four, but it's really the Big Two and the slightly less Big Two, and then the Group of Five, right? So just when you have 16 team conferences, depth is in inevitability, which is a good thing for entertainment, just not good for individual situations of guys trying to win the Heisman. So no, I don't think so personally. I think if Travis Hunter wins the Heisman, I think it's going to be because Ashton Jeanty has not that he's fallen off by any means, but that teams are defending him and forcing Boise State to pass the ball and not letting them win with Ashton Jeanty. And he just continues what he's doing, right? Because what he's doing is historic. Don't get me wrong. It's just the storyline isn't as fresh as Ashton Jeanty and therefore not as fun to talk about.
Yeah, exactly. And I think about with Ashton Jeanty with next week. It's a 6-day selection for TV. The game against Nevada can either be on Fox or FS1, and I feel like he desperately needs that game to be on Fox. Just thinking of Ashton Jeanty and Travis Hunter's path to the Heisman. I think it's interesting too, like that you mentioned the big two, Big Ten and SEC, and then the slightly less powerful two, as you put it, with the ACC and the Big 12. Because another guy that comes to mind for me is Jake Retzloff for BYU for Heisman. For typically, if you're in a power conference and your team is undefeated, if your team's 8-0 and you have 18 touchdown passes and you're the quarterback of that team, like you should be a Heisman frontrunner. But he's not getting any Heisman love, sort of because these narratives are being driven about like the SEC and the Big Ten, and the amount of media attention that they get. And we're already seeing that because I know I've told you before and I've told other people about how there's hardly any other conference that's on ABC other than the SEC. And ABC always has the most watched games each week. So it's interesting you mentioned that because I think it sucks that Colorado right now is only 23. It sucks even more that Colorado isn't even the top ranked team in their conference in the Big 12. And it sucks even more that the Big 12 is about probably the third most exposed power conference in the FBS. So every single way just feels like the snowball of just everything going against Travis Hunter just builds up. And it's not his fault at all.
I think in particular to last week, the only two guys that really fell out of the race essentially were Blake Horvath. You were there in person. It did not go well for Navy. They had what, six turnovers? And then Garrett Nussmeier. I think any inkling of LSU having a Heisman contender in Nussmeier just got nulled by the dominant comeback by A&M, especially after it looked like A&M was going to win that game. They were up by double digits, kind of took the crowd out of it for a little bit, and then A&M just roared right back, right? I think that game in particular speaks to just the culture that Mike Elko is really building there. Yeah, I'm sure everyone listening to this saw his comments about, yeah, we're building like a real program or whatever it was exactly. But I think those are the only two guys that were we were having conversations about winning it possibly that got knocked out of the race.
Yeah, exactly. And we were going to touch on Blake Horvath. Not much to say there. It's just a shame because if you look at Blake Horvath's stats, he averaged about like 7 yards per carry, but it's the fumbles that did Navy in. He had 7 yards per carry and over 100 yards too. That's something that's overlooked. He had over 100 yards and he had two 40-yard runs against Notre Dame. But like I've said to other people around work that we're talking about the game, you can't expect to beat the 12th team in the country with six turnovers, and that's just what was Navy's undoing. They're still having a fine season. They have a chance to do great special stuff, but yeah, with Blake Horvath, he's out of the race. But Nussmeier is interesting too because Nussmeier was putting up numbers for sure, but with LSU, I just feel like LSU lost too early for him to really be in the race.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I couldn't agree more with you. Yeah, it's a shame. But the Navy was not competitive in any way, shape, or form. Um,
Yeah,
we
so we can. Oh, sorry.
oh go ahead.
No, I was saying so we can go to our players of the week, if you would like.
Yeah, we'll start off with our offensive player of the week as always. Mine is Bo Brungard, the quarterback from Youngstown State, in a huge overtime win over North Dakota last week. He was 18 attempts for 191 yards and three touchdowns on the ground. He was 18 attempts for 191 yards and three touchdowns. In the air, he was 8 for 12, 72 yards, one touchdown, one interception. Everyone knew that he was really going to be running the ball, and they still put up 41 points despite not having one receiver on the squad to reach 30 yards, which is just an insane feat to put up north of 40 points without having a receiver that has 30 yards. I don't understand the math behind that, but anyway, he was a reserve quarterback last year who stepped in as the starter this year. Youngstown State has had a rough schedule, man. Pitt was on their get paid to play game. They've had a couple other games that were a little bit tougher on the FCS side, but Boat Run Guard with a fantastic performance. His national championships in 93 and 94. Maybe Bo won't see the same success that his dad had there, but he's certainly been putting up a storm, putting on a show in the past couple weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. Youngstown State's having a solid year, and what's new? The Missouri Valley Conference is stacked as always, and the Penguins are a quiet sleeper, really. If you want to talk about a league with a lot of parity, the Missouri Valley Conference is it. So definitely a great, just a great line of just tradition that Youngstown State has. Youngstown State, I know we forget about them. They're kind of the power of yesteryear, really, but this year, I mean, they're reminding people that they are legit and they are still there. They are still very much in the thick of it in the Missouri Valley Football Conference. So
And
for
what's
my
so
offense, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good. I was just gonna say like what's impressive to me too, and not that I'm following Youngstown State very closely, where I have a feeling for what the morale is and all that. I don't. But man, in the 2 weeks before beating North Dakota, they lost by 50 points to South Dakota State, and then they lost to South Dakota last week. And so to beat a top 10 team in overtime really speaks to your willpower, right? And a lot of teams wouldn't have much willpower when having back-to-back losses like that. So I thought that spoke a lot of just of the team in general from an outsider's perspective, at least.
Yeah, that's a great point about the morale. I mean, about the season still being kind of young, not exactly too old and everything, but you need to recover quick, like you're getting to. You need to recover quick, and it seems like Youngstown State did that very well this past week. I'm going for my player of the week. I'm going with the quarterback on the other end of the country, outside, especially actually outside the mainland. I'm going to go with Braden Shager, famous for his Shager bombs and everything. But I mean, if I were to tell you that my player of the week was a run and shoot quarterback who threw for 153 yards, you'd look at me crazy. But it wasn't the passing; it was Braden Shager doing it on the ground that caught my and probably the nation's attention. And everyone that was watching that game past midnight, excuse me, where Brady Shager had 19 carries, 120 yards, and 4 touchdowns for the Hawaii Warriors. He's the first Hawaii quarterback to run for over 100 yards since Chevin Cordero did so in 2020 against Fresno State. And it was the most for a Hawaii quarterback since Cole McDonald ran for 140 against New Mexico. Coincidentally, 5 years to the date, October 26, 2019. So Hawaii likely will not reach a bowl, but it's just so impressive to see one of the I wouldn't say pioneering quarterbacks, but one of the stereotypical quarterbacks of the run and shoot, Timmy Chang, or sorry, prototype. One of the prototype quarterbacks of the run and shoot, Timmy Chang, coaching Braden Shager and having those elements of the quarterback run in there be so central and be so effective in that run and shoot. Shager's been fun to watch throughout the year. It's just a shame. Hawaii needs to win their final 4 games to make a bowl game. And looking at the schedule, the only game that's really losable is UNLV, but that one's at home, so that possibly helps. But hopefully Hawaii can make it work. Unfortunately, they have to go 7-5 to make a bowl because they scheduled 2 FCS schools because Oregon canceled their game with Hawaii all the way back in January of this year on short notice. So, but Braden Shager, definitely great to see a run and shoot quarterback running it so well and so often.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was on mute. No, that's awesome. I did not get to stay up that late to watch that game. That's the shame about Hawaii football sometimes, man. That's on so late, and it's not always the most accessible to the casual fan. That you're missing out on a lot of great stuff, and I know I'm talking to myself in that too. But a lot of great football out there. For my defensive player of the week, I want to go with Michael Taff, the safety from Texas. Against Vanderbilt, he was just like a mesh safety net, you could say, in coverage if you saw that on Twitter and get that joke. But He played 66 snaps, had 5 tackles, 2 run stops, and 1 reception allowed on 38 coverage snaps, in addition to 1 interception and 1 pass breakup. Usually we highlight smaller schools guys on the players of the week, but I wanted to show some love in particular to him because it's a story that's not common enough now in this modern era of college football. He walked on to UT Austin. He played in 13 games as a freshman. Then he started his sophomore year. Now he's a 2-year starter as he's a junior. You just don't see it enough where you don't see enough walk-on stories. I saw one. I think it was Florida actually. Um, I think it was Cormani McLean transferred. And like there were no scholarship spots left, so he like got the equivalent of a scholarship in NIL money, which was just like ruining it for like walk-ons, right? And so it's whenever you see a walk-on story in a power conference like that, and a guy that sticks with it for multiple years on end and puts his time, it's just like maybe heartwarming is a bit of a stretch, but like it's just awesome to see, right? And what was the norm and maybe what we took for granted a few years ago before NIL and the portal. It's just awesome to see when those guys that are sticking by it end up actually making a difference for the team and the university that they love, right? If they chose that school organically aside from football. So Michael Taft, cool name to see, and hopefully he continues this. Texas has had a fantastic year, aside from the one loss to Georgia. So hopefully he continues that.
Yeah, that's a great choice right there. Michael Taft out there and everything. And it's interesting how we gravitate more towards the way things used to be, really. I mean, at least the good aspects of it, because there are aspects of the NIL and the portal that have made, I guess, made college football better, made it better for the players and everything. But the walk-on stories like that are always great to see and everything. And we still have the Burlsworth Trophy for the best walk-on given. So, I mean. We still stories like that still get showcased all the time on the Burrowsville Trophy and everything. So going on,
Absolutely. It's an award that we don't talk about enough on here. So probably something we should look at more now that I think of it. But
yeah, we truly do not. That is true, Jackson. But going on to my next player of the week, excuse me, for my defense player of the week, I have Jamar Shagog for Robert Morris, and Shagog had 10 tackles for the Colonials in a defensive struggle, or really just a dominant defensive performance, I should say, against St. Francis for the Colonials, as they won 17-0 over St. Francis. And keep in mind, St. Francis was a school that beat Kent State excuse me, that beat Kent State for the Northeast Conference's second FBS win ever. And Robert Morris now has a transit win against a MAC school. The defense looks great, but keep in mind, Robert Morris is 4-0 in the Northeast Conference, and a lot of people, myself included, have been ranking Duquesne. I put Duquesne at 25th in my poll. They've been receiving votes in other people's polls. It's because Duquesne is undefeated in FCS play. Robert Morris slipped up a couple times in FCS play, but the Colonials, I mean, they're on a crash course to do something great in the Northeast Conference. And who knows, when they play Duquesne, all the marbles in the Northeast Conference, all the marbles in Western Pennsylvania might be up for stake. So Jamar Shagog, a big part of what Robert Morris is doing in their hopeful return to the playoffs. I don't think they've been in the playoffs. I want to say it's been since 2019 that they've been in the playoffs. So it's been a while, but Jamar Shagog for Robert Morris and that great defensive performance against St. Francis.
for my HBCU player of the week, I'd like to go with two, if that's allowed. One we've talked about previously on the show, Jada Byers, if you remember the name, the running back for Virginia Union. This past week, he had 324 rush yards and 6 touchdowns. Just an insane performance. That would have been great for passing, much less for a running back. It's his second straight week that's north that where he's north of 200 yards. So fantastic years on end. When I was talking to you pre-show, 2022 was really the season that stood out with him. So the fact that he's still putting up that kind of production is impressive. But and then for my main HBCU player of the week, Devin Verstegen. the punter from Winston-Salem. Now, I know what you're thinking. How could the punter of a team that lost be your most valuable player of the week? First of all, losing to a top 20 team, an undefeated team by only 9 points, isn't really a knock much on them. Uh, it's the same concept kind of how like Illinois got blown out last week by Oregon and still stayed ranked. Like some teams are just better than you and you perform as expected, and that's not necessarily a knock on you, right? Now, what is appealing about Devin, he had 10 punts for 502 yards. That is a 50.2 yard average per punt. Do you know how many schools much less D2 schools would kill for a punter that like consistently can hit 50 yards? And your boy Devin did it 7 times last week. So awesome performance. If there's one position in football where you can't really blame a win or a loss on that position, it's probably punter, right? Because if he's out there, something has gone wrong in the first place. So Devin Verstegen, again, fantastic performance with double digit punts last week.
Yeah, and it's amazing that game. Winston-Salem. Well, first off, with Jada Byers, it's just great to see that bigger programs, even at the FCS level, didn't poach him for NIL money. He stayed put at Virginia Union. That's the place where he wanted to be, and it's still paying off. Jada Byers is, he looks like to me he could be a late round pick, potentially an undrafted free agent. We saw at the Division two level for HBCUs, particularly Emmanuel Wilson for Fort Valley State had a good preseason. I want to say it was like 2023, where he had a very solid preseason for the Packers. Didn't make the final roster, but had good moments out of Fort Valley State. So I can see the same thing for Jada Byers. And Byers can be a great kick returner. He's slippery, 5'7", 185. So I can see him fit into the new kick return role, into a Cavante Turpin type of role, a game breaker on the new with the new kick return that the NFL has. Because if you think about it, I really think running backs could thrive in that type of role because the new kick return, you have to fit through smaller alleys with all the players lined up together. So I can see Jada Byers, excuse me, having a good NFL future. And with Devin Bursigan, just a great performance, a losing effort. But can we just talk about the fact that Johnson C. Smith beat Winston-Salem at Bowman Gray Stadium, Winston-Salem State's home, for the first time in 46 years? I mean, my jaw dropped when I saw the story about that.
I did not realize it had been that long. That's insane to not have. Yeah, that's wild. 46 years is a very long time.
So exactly. I mean, there really isn't much else to say beyond that. Johnson C. Smith is having a special season, getting some mentions on College Game Day too. Very, very great to see the CIAA getting some mentions in the HBCU world, as we're always focused on the MEAC and the SWAC. But it's great to see Johnson C. Smith and the CIAA getting some national attention on game day as they did a few weeks ago. So staying in Division Two, but with the SIAC, the SEAC, I'm going with my player of the week being Deshaun Mitchell for Savannah State, who had 5 catches and 2 touchdowns. He had 5 catches, 133 yards, and 2 touchdowns for the Savannah State Tigers. And this year seems like the year of the wide receiver in Black college football because we've talked about Giovanni Gibson for Arkansas Pine Bluff, and he shined on that Friday night game on ESPN2 against Prairie View, had over 100 yards, and I think he had 191 yards to be exact, and 2 touchdowns for the Golden Lion to Pine Bluff in their win. And Deshaun Mitchell shining this year too, 33 catches, 591 yards, 6 touchdowns. And I talked a little bit before about how I like to pick seniors, talk about the implications for All-Star games because I love my All-Star games. But Deshaun Mitchell looks like a shoe-in to go to Nollins for the Legacy Bowl out there in late February. And he's just a lanky athlete, good deep threat. I mean, great ball skills and everything. So I think any team would be lucky to have him as a UDFA, if anything. And even the spring league or the spring football league with the UFL being a option for Deshaun Mitchell. But I love seeing what he's doing out there with Savannah State and just having a stellar season. Just a great year for HBCU wide receivers all around.
You bring up a fantastic point about the new kickoff return rules in the NFL and our format. And I can't believe I haven't thought about that and how that translates to scouting and turn college because you don't see anything like that in college football, right? So I'm curious, there probably is going to be a premium on guys that just have sheer yardage production at the running back position because that's what it's essentially going to be. So yeah, that's a really good point and something I hadn't thought of.
Yeah, it's interesting too because, like you said, like there's no tape on it. But when I think in my mind of guys that I would want returning kicks in the new format, even though kickers have just been booting the ball out of the end zone, and that's totally fine. But I would want a running back who can go between the tackles, has experience fitting in tight lanes. And I think to myself, like Cordero Patterson is a perfect guy for the new kick return. And the Steelers, I mean, the Steelers signed him almost right away when the new kick return was announced. Or was it the Steelers? I'm probably tripping, but some teams signed him right away. But but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's something that that I'm curious to see because we don't really have a draft cycle since that's been introduced, right? So that's something that'll be really interesting to see of guys that they bring on with that intent. So
Exactly. So Jackson, for games of the week, do you want to start for what games of the week that you're watching?
yeah, so I will start with my first one, Pitt at SMU. Now, Omar, you're the historian for network television. Is this the biggest game in ACC network history? Because I'm struggling to think of one. It's a relatively new network. There's the one that pops out in your mind, and then I'll kind of dig deeper into the matchup. But I wanted to ask you.
So I think because I think the ACC network opened in or started in 2018 or 2019. I think whatever game that Notre Dame played Duke on the ACC network was pretty big at the time. I want to say it was 2019, but anytime you have Notre Dame on a conference network, it's a huge event. So I will say that probably had a personal bias and everything. But in terms of national implications, yes, I totally agree. But also, I think ESPN should be ashamed of themselves for putting Duke Miami at the noon spot on
Yes.
ABC. So. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, I agree. Well, first, it's also a shame that honestly, this should be like the nighttime ABC game, in my opinion. The nighttime ABC game is, as you mentioned, SEC on ABC. It is, I believe it's South Carolina is the home team. I think it's A&M on the road. I could be wrong about that. But man, like this game definitely has bigger implications in a Power Four conference, right? Than that one. So, yeah, it's a shame this isn't at least the ESPN game with Louisville Clemson. That at least you could have switched with the ACC network. But both teams are undefeated in conference play, along with the likes of Miami and Clemson. This is a huge game in the race for the ACC because of those four teams that are undefeated in conference play. We have two matchups left between each other. This game, and then Clemson plays Pitt on November 16th. Now for Pitt, they're coming off of a long week of prep. They played last Thursday night where they got three pick sixes, as I mentioned before, and they made the completions per game leader in the country, and Kyle McCord just looked silly. On offense, we don't know yet if quarterback Eli Holstein is going to be back or not. He left in the fourth quarter with an undisclosed injury, and coach Pat Marduzzi isn't really giving much information publicly as he shouldn't. But for Pitt, this is a little bit of uncharted territory, right? This is the best start since 1982. No one's really taken them seriously before in an ACC race in a while. Well, I guess it wasn't that long with Kenny Pickett, but and then for SMU, maybe it's a little bit of a different feeling since they weren't in the ACC before, but you could argue almost that this is the standard. They started 8-0 as recently as 2019, and the head coach Rhett Lashlee was actually the offensive coordinator then. So maybe he wasn't the head coach, but still kind of have that carry on from when Sonny Dykes left. So yeah, it's going to be a great game. I can't believe it's on the ACC network, but excited to see how this one plays out. Also, homecoming for SMU. Don't know why they would put that for was probably one of their tougher games of the year at home, but I guess not everyone could have seen Pitt being so well this year, being so good.
Exactly. And it's just interesting too that the first meeting between these two for a while, just I want to say it's the first meeting since the 83 Cotton Bowl, where we had Dan Marino playing Eric Dickerson and Craig James. And now we have this game with so much on the line in the ACC. It's almost poetic. And it's also a kind of sad indictment of the state of college football, where the 1983 Cotton Bowl and other notable bowl rematches like that are now conference games. But Everyone's heard plenty of that, really. So what use is that to go on? So for my first game, I'm going with Morehead State against St. Thomas this week. And Morehead State shocked a lot of people, myself included, when they upset Dayton last week. Dayton looked like the front runner in the Pioneer Football League with a four. I think they came in with a five. They came in with one loss. So they came in with a 5-1 record, I believe. And Morehead State just came in and just dominated them on defense. They held Dayton to 198 yards, and the defense was just lights out, and they had to be. The offense only scored 14 points, and that brings us to the bigger point of Morehead State's offense having trouble this year, only scoring 16 points per game and averaging. Really, I just didn't know teams average like this few yards per game in this day and age, 243 yards per game on offense. So the offense will need to step up against St. Thomas this week. St. Thomas allowed 32 point or St. Thomas has scored 34 points in their last 4 games. I know I wrote off St. Thomas after not only did they lose to a subdivision one team in non-conference, they also lost to Lindenwood, I think a sub 500 team. Yeah, sub 500 team in the Ohio Valley Conference by 64. They lost 64 to nothing to Lindenwood. So I wrote off St. Thomas as this. I thought it was a rebuilding year, but St. Thomas has come back strong. They're undefeated in conference play. But if Morehead State wins this one, they'll have the tiebreaker over St. Thomas. And this paves the way for Morehead State to potentially get its first playoff appearance because not only do they play St. Thomas, they also play Drake, the other undefeated team in conference play in the Pioneer Football League. Leading the way for Morehead State, you have Matthew McClelland, who I think is the legitimate Buck Buchanan Award candidate. He has 65 tackles, 4 interceptions at the defensive back position. And keep in mind, a defensive back has not won the Walter Payton Award since I think 2002 when Rasheed Mathis of Bethune-Cookman won it. The Eagles have 3 players with 7+ tackles for loss. And I think that they can hold St. Thomas at bay, but this is just a really underrated story developing in the FCS with Morehead State pursuing their first playoff appearance.
No, that's not something that you hear about enough. And anything that I feel like the people that casually follow FCS football, it's really the Ohio Valley Football Conference. It's some of the bigger ones. And no, like all of these conferences, man, just like at the FBS, have their own storylines, have their own interesting angles. And I know I've learned about it over the course of our show, and it's just gets the more you get into it, the more you realize how much you don't know. At least that's how I feel. So, but I love learning about it, love keeping up with it. So, for my second game of the week, I'm gonna go with Harvard at Dartmouth. Last week I talked at length about Dartmouth's quarterback situation. I talked your guys' ears off about the quarterback room, only for them to have 70 passing yards in the game. It was really running back Hugh Jones who had 182 rushing yards and a touchdown to take control of the game to win it over Columbia for Dartmouth. That's a compliment to Dartmouth, though. Good teams find different ways to win games, and Dartmouth certainly did that. For Harvard, I've also talked extensively about quarterback Jaden Craig before. I'm not going to say that this one comes down to quarterback play because that's pretty much every game if you can summarize it. But another huge game in the Ivy League where again friendly reminder the regular season is the only thing that matters. There is no postseason play including a conference championship game or lack thereof.
Yeah, exactly. And it's great to see Dartmouth getting back to where they were before last year after the tragic death of Buddy Stevens, one of the greatest Ivy League coaches of all time. Rest in peace to him. But man, like if you want to talk about vintage Dartmouth, like you said, 70 yards passing, Q Jones took over the game, and Q Jones has been great recently. He's had a couple 100-yard games, I think, the past few weeks. So that was vintage Dartmouth against Columbia. And they played Columbia's game and they just out physicaled them, really. This one's going to be great to see because this Harvard team, you don't typically see. I mean, Harvard, from what I've seen in the past, is they're a very running back power team, but I don't think they've had a passer as great as Jaden Craig in a while. And I know you've talked about him a lot on the podcast. So this one is going to be fun to see. It's interesting too because I want to say it was like 5 years ago. Yeah, 5 years ago, almost to the day. I think the game was on November 1st, where Harvard played Dartmouth, and the game was decided on a Hail Mary, and it helped decide the Ivy League title. Where had Dartmouth lost that game, they would have lost their share of the Ivy League title if they didn't throw that last second Hail Mary against Harvard. So very exciting game, and Dartmouth has a home field advantage at Memorial Stadium. So very intrigued with that one. Going on with my next game of the week, I'm going to stay in the Ivy League with Ivy League Friday night. We have Yale and the Columbia team that we talked about that we just talked about just now. And I want to shine a spotlight on David Pantelis. If you want to talk about someone that was made for Friday night, I mean, David Pantelis made some circus catches against Penn last week in their 31 to 10 game. The Yale defense stepped up big time after starting up the season, allowing 30 points per game in their first five contests. And now they're at 500 right now, and they face Columbia. Or sorry, they're not at 500. They're 4-2 right now. My mistake. And they face a Columbia squad that's kind of, they played a physical game against Dartmouth. They might be a little worn out. The game's at the End Stadium in Columbia. So it'll be interesting to see. Yale can kind of insert themselves back into the race. And if they win out, they have a chance of becoming the first Ivy League champion with two conference losses since the early 80s. That's a storyline that we've been following on this podcast throughout the season. So that one's going to be one to watch. Columbia, this is a must win for Columbia. I mean, I think bottom line up front, really they to stay in and at least get a share of their second Ivy League title since 1961, or yeah, their first Ivy League title, I should say, since 1961, second ever. They need to beat this Yale team, and they need to key in on David Pantelis, which that might not be hard to do for this Columbia secondary, but they might get gashed by the run. So interesting to see there, David Pantelis versus a Columbia secondary, and on Ivy League Friday night at 7 o'clock on ESPNU.
I love Ivy League Friday nights. It's definitely a fun part. Actually going to be just not that far away from my place up here in Westchester County. So definitely something keeping tabs on ticket prices for sure. But I hate the cold, so it's definitely going to have to dip below what it is. So for my last game of the week to watch, I'm gonna go with two and not talk about either of them as much at length, one with larger implications than the other. But I'm gonna first go with Duke Miami purely because I think this could be a Manny Diaz revenge game. I know he had the quote this week when someone asked him about it inevitably. He was like, there's a great saying that no man crosses the same river twice like before. He's not the same man and it's not the same river. I don't know. It was an interesting quote. He says he's moved on, but I don't know if you remember Omar. When Miami fired Manny Diaz, it was like hours later that they announced the Cristobal hire. No one wants to be broken up with and then wake up the next morning to a picture posted of like their ex with someone else, right? Like it was very quick. There's no way that that doesn't stick with him at some point. Now, from the football side of things and not the storyline side of things, it is a pure mismatch. Miami is has one of the best quarterbacks in the country, obviously in Cam Ward. They're like ridiculously good on third down. They're 60% on third down. Um, and Duke actually does have a pretty good third down defense. They're only allowing 29%, but Duke is completely mismatched. It's just a matter of like if Manny Diaz has anything in him that could possibly get an upset in this game, this or get a major upset, this would probably be the game. But curious to see how this goes. He was fired a few years ago. I don't really think there are any transfers left on the Duke roster that followed him from Miami or anything like that, but one to keep an eye on for sure until it gets out of hand at least. And then the other one that has larger implications, Tennessee Martin at Tennessee State. It's third place versus second place in the Big South OVC. The only team in front of both of them in conference play is Southeast Missouri State, who's undefeated in conference play. Something to keep an eye on. UT Martin has the third best rushing defense in all of the FCS, only allowing 88 rush yards per game. I think Tennessee State might know a thing or two about running the ball. I'm not sure, judging off of their head coach, but um but no, it'll be an interesting one to keep an eye on.
Yeah, so I want to push back a little bit on the Duke Miami thing. I know they're 20-point underdogs, but they are 6-2, and they almost did beat SMU this past week. Actually took them to overtime and everything. So I don't think it'll get as much out of hand because Miami likes to play with its food per se. So I think it'll be interesting.
I definitely think it can be. I'll be blunt. That is just the, hey, I have to pretend like it's not going to happen so that I can hope it does happen. Because if I hold out hope that Duke can get the upset over, an in-state rival for me like Miami, then it's never gonna happen, right? I just have to resign myself to the fact it won't, and then maybe there's a chance it will.
That mentality worked for me last year with the Army Air Force, where I had an apathetic attitude, but we ended up beating our first ranked team since 1972 when we played Air Force. So I definitely understand that there. So going for my last game of the week, we have probably the game of the night on Thursday night on ESPN2. ESPN2 must have heard my tweets. They must have seen my articles about how much of a boon FCS football on ESPN2 was for the network and for the schools, where we have North Carolina Central and South Carolina State on ESPN2 Halloween night. It'll be a bad night to be a frozen pizza in the Boerhaus house. But we have Eric. We have just everyone talks about the quarterback battle here. Walker Harris is just a great quarterback. I mean, of course, great quarterback taking over for Gavius Richard. He's had a solid year, but talk about Jamari Taylor, a special running back, 790 yards, 10 touchdowns this year from North Carolina Central, anchoring down the run game, where Walker Harris has been a little bit banged up at times during the year, but Harris has still had a respectable year as well, with already I think 13 touchdowns. South Carolina State though, this is not your dad's South Carolina State team under Buddy Pugh. Defensively strong and everything, where they just they grind the ball out, they play tough defense, and they just out physical you. I mean, this is the new South Carolina State team. Last week they dropped 69 points on Delaware State. Eric Phoenix had 341 yards and four touchdowns. And then the backup came in. And then South Carolina State threw for over 400 yards with the backup in. So 69 points last week, over 400 yards passing. Eric Phoenix is having a sensational year, 1,791 yards, 14 touchdowns. And it's still early. It's good. It's going to be October 31st when they play, but I like to think that this might be the MEAC championship game. Honestly, it is a 5 game sprint, something I always say whenever I'm on the podcast with Dwayne Nash of the Yard HBCU, our good friend. But it's a 5 game sprint. But I just think South Carolina State and North Carolina Central are just head and shoulders above the rest of the pack because Howard lost to Norfolk State this past week. Norfolk State slipped up plenty of times in non-conference play, didn't look very solid. Delaware State is a year or two away. They've shown flashes here and there, but they're still 1-7. I mean, I really think that just comes down, and also too Morgan State. Morgan State also looks a year away, but their offense just continues holding back. But I think that the MEAC runs through North Carolina Central and South Carolina State, and talk about a way to introduce the country to these two pretty much flagship programs of the MEAC on ESPN2 on Thursday night. So definitely gonna be tuned into that one, and I'm excited for it. I really think that this could decide who plays in Celebration Bowl.
Yeah, and any time that you have a game of this magnitude on a weeknight, it really puts all the attention on that game, right? I know it's a little bit tough when you've got, TNF on Prime and the NFL, and obviously it's Halloween night, so not everyone's going to be staying back and watching football like they might usually. But man, hopefully so because it's going to be a great game. It's going to be a lot of fun to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll throw in one more game too, really quick for Army Air Force on CBS. And it feels like 96 for Army. 1996, ABC, Brent Musburger, Dick Vermeil came into West Point, called Army Air Force with Army undefeated heading into or with Air Force coming to town. This time CBS is in town at West Point. We got Rich Waltz on the call with Ross Tucker. And man, talk about Heisman implications for Bryson Daly if he performs great and has a great game because I mean, Air Force Navy had over 1 million viewers. Navy Notre Dame had almost 3 million viewers. So eyes will be on Air Force Navy at noon on CBS. So watch that instead of Big Ten kickoff and of course the SEC on ABC.
Yeah, yeah, it's It's so annoying that these big games, like we have a top four matchup and it's at noon. It just doesn't seem right. But one more thing on North Carolina Central, something that probably a lot of people don't realize, they have like a top 15 total defense in all of the FCS, right? So this is not because sometimes I feel like with the MEAC and SWAC and just HBCU football in general, we talk a lot in the context of HBCU football and not necessarily the league that they play in or the division that they play in. And no, like they're a legit defense by FCS standards, right? It's not just the MEAC and SWAC that they look dominant in. So
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they've looked great all year. I mean, and it's funny you say that too about the context because we focus on Walker Harris, we focus on Jamari Taylor, but man, like the defense, they are just as they deserve top billing too.
yeah, yeah, no, they really do. They've been outstanding this year. They also have. I'm just looking through some of the NCAA or the NCAA like stats site. They are the seventh best third down defense too in FCS football, only allowing a little under 29% to be converted. That's impressive.
Um, that's stellar total. That's almost like a quarter of third downs.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. So that's definitely good. And obviously the strong point for South Carolina State is going to be that offense, right? Particularly the passing offense. So that's going to be the entertaining part. Mostly is going to be that South Carolina State passing offense versus NC Central's defense.
Yeah, I totally agree, Jackson. But I don't think I have anything else to add for this week. It's a very enticing week, very appetizing week indeed. Do you have anything to add?
I don't think so. Still mad at Disney for putting an amazing game like Pitt SMU on the ACC network, as opposed to ABC or ESPN. But no, I have nothing else to add. It's gonna be a fun Halloween. Oh, well, I think our only FBS game that night. Just a couple little tidbits that I saw. Where are my notes? I saw some interesting things about Tulane. I know they haven't had the year. Maybe they're 6-2. I'm not going to complain about their year. It's just they're a couple years removed from like their biggest win in program history, right? But maybe I'll make an Instagram post out of it. Forget I sent anything about it because I can't find my notes. But I'll make a post about it, and if you catch it before Halloween night, then you'll see some spooky stats about the Green Wave.
Yeah, absolutely. But don't sleep on Biff Coji's guys for Charlotte. They almost beat Memphis. That's the game we were
Yes,
talking about on
yes,
Saturday.
yes. It'll be a good matchup. Charlotte's at home, I think, too. So
Yeah, exactly. So it'll be interesting to watch too. I mean, create some crazy things happen on Halloween and everything. But until next time, everyone, thank you for watching or listening and stay safe this week. And until next time, peace, love, and soul on the Burger Popper.